I'm Jimmy Seitz. Welcome to Lesson 12, which happens to be our final lesson for this series, the 23rd Psalm in Troubled Times. This has been a fascinating study for me, and I have learned so much about the relationship between the sheep and the shepherd. I've also discovered that Psalm 23 is a gold mine, just full of beautiful nuggets. I've asked about the paintings that my wife Amanda did that keep making appearances in this series. One is called The Fourth Disciple, and it portrays Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane with Peter, James, and John the night before his crucifixion. The fourth disciple in the painting represents you. Would you have stayed awake on that very crucial occasion in the garden that night and prayed as Jesus requested? Or would you have fallen asleep like the other disciples did? The other painting is called Bread of Life, and it portrays the resurrected Lord, and He's serving the bread of life to you. If you're interested in obtaining these paintings or a print of one of these paintings, you can do so by going to amandaseitz.com. We've come to the final phrase that ends Psalm 23. It's the second part of verse 6. I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. If I were to ask you to stop right now and just write down the one word that comes to your mind when you hear this phrase, what would you write? Probably, like most of us, we'd write the word heaven. And thus we begin with a problem. You and I are at a disadvantage when we read this phrase and try to interpret it right now. Why? Because we live in the 21st century Anno Domini, in other words AD, which is medieval Latin, and it means in the year of the Lord. In other words, we live 2,000 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. But King David wrote Psalm 23 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. So when we put our theological glasses on, they include the lenses that can see the life of Christ and the birth of the early church, the writings of the New Testament, 2,000 years worth of church history, all the collective Christian theology and the thought and experience and books and preaching for many, many centuries. We have developed a concept of heaven in our minds as the amazing celestial city where we're going to go after we die. We're going to live with God in His house for eternity. There's going to be no darkness there, no tears, no growing old, no death. I mean, it's the Garden of Eden restored, the natural order of things once again prevailing. Heaven to us is our greatest motivation to live a godly life and to believe that God is going to save us through His grace. We sing a lot of songs about heaven, don't we? And we see through heavenly tinted lenses. Well, when King David put on his theological glasses, his lenses were quite different. He couldn't see any of the stuff that I just talked about. He didn't even know about Jesus of Nazareth. His concept of where you go after you die was completely different. The Jewish people of the Old Testament, they believed in an afterlife, all right, but it wasn't anything like you really look forward to. As a matter of fact, belief in an afterlife was very much a universal concept during that time. It still is. In other words, it's something that appears in all cultures, but not all cultures agree on the nature of the afterlife. So if you wanted to compose a summary of the various beliefs of the many different cultures during the time of King David, most cultures believed that you do have a shadowy kind of existence in the next world, and there's not much information about it. It wasn't until maybe 400 or 500 years after King David that we really have a clear understanding of the afterlife in a positive way. It actually includes a bodily resurrection on the last day. For example, the book of Daniel. It's written 400 years after David wrote Psalm 23, and here's what it says. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. That's Daniel 12:2. This attests to the resurrection of both the righteous, those who gain everlasting life, and the wicked, those who gain shame and everlasting contempt. But David did not have this concept in his mind when he wrote Psalm 23. Now, taking this into consideration, let's once again go to our text for today, and let's see if David has heaven in his mind. I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. I think we can conclude David is not thinking about spending eternity with God in heaven as we think of it. So what's he referring to? Well, that's the big question. And to answer this question properly, we have to be faithful to our method of interpretation of the entire psalm up to this point. First, the psalm is written from the sheep's point of view. The change of preposition chart that we've been looking at is keeping us on track. In the A section, the sheep is talking about the Good Shepherd, verses 1 through 3. In the B section, the sheep is talking to the Good Shepherd, verses 4 and 5. In the section C, the sheep is talking about the Good Shepherd again, but he's talking about being with the Good Shepherd. It is definitely possible that David is thinking about the sheep and writing from his or her perspective when he is making his closing statement in Psalm 23. Think about it from the sheep's perspective. Remember that Psalm 23 covers the annual cycle of the sheep. So it's to the point in the story of Psalm 23 where winter is coming, and the sheep is looking forward to leaving the tabletop and going back to the safety of the warm barn. There are no predators they have to fear there inside that barn. There's plenty of food and water, and there's time with the shepherd. He's going to be shearing them. It's also birthing time, and the shepherd's relaxed. John 10 fits beautifully with the psalm at this point. It's as if Jesus spoke the words recorded by John in chapter 10, 1 through 15, in direct response to Psalm 23. So I want us to take a look at it. John 10 is awesome. Here we go. Truly I tell you, anyone who doesn't enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens it for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought all his own outside, he goes ahead of them. The sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will never follow a stranger. Instead, they will run away from him because they don't know the voice of strangers. Now look what he does right here. I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep didn't listen to them. I am the gate. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will come in and go out and find pasture. A thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it in abundance. Now he's going to switch metaphors, and he's not going to be the gate anymore. Now he's going to be the good shepherd that opens the gate. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, since he is not the shepherd and doesn't own the sheep, leaves them and runs away when he sees a wolf coming. The wolf then snatches and scatters them. This happens because he is a hired hand and doesn't care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me. And I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. The beauty of John 10 is that it captures the peace and joy of a sheep that has a good shepherd, but it's metaphorically saying to those of us who are Christians that we have a peace and a joy that's beyond anything that the world can offer, because we have a good shepherd, capital G, capital S, that's willing to lay his life down for us. As a matter of fact, he already did. And when you understand this, it's easy to look back at Psalm 23 and see just how important the shepherd's home ranch is to the sheep during the days of David. Now with this in mind, let's look once again at our text. I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. Let's divide that phrase into two phrases. We'll start with the beginning. I will dwell in. This phrase is translated identically in several major historic manuscripts that are used for modern translations. The Septuagint, the Symmachus, the Syriac version, the Targum, the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's version, the Masoretic text, all use the interpretation, I will return to. Now let's look at as long as I live. Literally, when you look at the Hebrew, the translation from that language is for length of days, which is a way of saying forever. So when you put these two together, you come up with the following translation of verse 6. I will return to the house of the Lord for my length of days. This definitely fits within the sheep's perspective of returning to the warm barn of the shepherd every year, that annual cycle, to spend the winter season. How about that? Now, the next question in our interpretation is this a double entendre? Could it be that King David is actually referring to a house of God, not just to the shepherd's barn, so to speak? And if so, what kind of house is he referring to? So to answer this question most accurately, what we have to do is look at what the Germans call the Sitz im Leben, in other words, the setting of David's life. Most likely, he's an older king looking back on when he and his army went in and conquered the small city-state of Jebus. It's where the Jebusites lived. It was a fortified city on a little hill. And he did this around 1003 or 1004 BC in the first decade of his 40-year reign as king. And David renamed the city as Yerushalom, in other words, the city of peace. We know it as Jerusalem. And one of the first things he did was to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem. And you can read about this in 1 Samuel 7. It's a fascinating story. It's got those details in there about when the ox stumbles and one of David's mighty men, Uzzah, grabs the ark and tries to keep it from falling, or at least the pole holding the ark, and God smites him dead because you're not supposed to touch that. It made David really mad. But by the time they got it back to Jerusalem, David is so excited about bringing the ark in that he strips down to basically his underwear and dances through the streets and the crowds, bringing the Ark of the Covenant in to the tabernacle at Jerusalem. Now why? Why was David so excited? His wife was disgusted. Saul's daughter looked out the window, saw her husband doing that, and man, I mean, it was almost the end of their relationship after that. Why did he get that fired up? Well, here's my theory. Let's talk about Judah for a minute. Look at the direct descendant of Abraham. You have Abraham, you have Isaac, then you have Jacob, and then you have Judah. So he's the great-grandson of Father Abraham. And Judah had something happen in his life that really set something into play that's going to affect David later on. Judah had a bunch of brothers, and eventually he moved off from them and he started raising some sons with some Canaanite women. And as a result of that, his sons didn't turn out all that well. And his first one, who had married a woman, was such a bad person that God killed him. Left his wife as a widow, and what's supposed to happen is the next brother in line is supposed to take her as one of his wives so that they can keep the name of Judah going, the bloodline, the seed line. Well, that guy dies, and so there's only one son left, and he's very young. When he got to that age, Judah didn't give her to him. And so she pretty well figured out she wasn't going to be married again. She was going to go to her grave in her widow's clothing. And so she played a trick on Judah. And she acted like she was a cult prostitute when it came time for Judah to go to the sheep shearing. He had a bunch of guys that worked for him as sheep shearers, so he took his shepherd's staff, a signet ring, and he dressed and he went on his way, and he stopped, saw this cult prostitute, and said, "Hey, sleep with me." And she said, "Well, what are you going to pay me?" And he said, "Well, I'll give you a goat." "Well, give it to me now." "I don't have one right now. I'll send it back with you." "Then you give me proof that you're going to send that goat." And he said, "Well, what do you want?" And she said, "Give me your staff, your signet ring, and the belt to your robe." And so he gave her those things. He slept with her. He didn't know it, but she got pregnant. Later on, after he was sending the goat to her through a friend, the friend couldn't find her. And so 3 months pass, and she comes up pregnant, living in the camp of Judah, right there in his own household. And so when he finds out she's pregnant because she's been playing the prostitute, he says, "Kill her." And so she sends a servant with the staff, a ring, and the piece of his robe. And then he said, "She has acted better than I have in all of this." So he didn't kill her. And because of that, 2 sons were born. And one of them was named Perez, and he was the firstborn to Judah and Tamar. Now, the reason I tell you that story is we're going to now jump over to Matthew, and we're going to look at the patrilineage of Jesus. So check out this chart right here. You'll notice that we start with Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then we have Judah and Tamar listed. Now let's keep going. There's Perez. There's Hezron, and then Ram, and Amminadab, and Nahshon, and Salmon and Rechab, and Boaz and Ruth. You've heard of them, right? Then you have Obed, who happens to be the grandfather of David. Then you have David's dad, Jesse. Then you have David himself. And David and Bathsheba are listed because through their union, they bring about the next king, and that is Solomon, who's number 15. Now, you can keep reading all the way down through this list, and you'll eventually come to Jesus at number 41 on the list. It's pretty fascinating. But I want us to focus on the red letters. Do you see them right there? It starts with Judah. Now, count with me as we go down, starting with Perez. He's number 1 after Judah. Hezron is number 2. Ram is 3. Amminadab is 4. Nahshon is 5. Salmon and Rechab is 6. Boaz and Ruth are 7. Obed is 8. Jesse is 9. And what is David? David is the 10th generation from Judah. Now we're going to go to the giving of the law in Deuteronomy. When the law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, one of the commandments found in Deuteronomy 23:2 stated this: "No one of illegitimate birth may enter the Lord's assembly, none of his descendants, even to the 10th generation, may enter the Lord's assembly." When you look at the genealogy of Judah and you see that the law of Moses was given centuries after Judah's sin and the illegitimate birth of Perez, you might say, well, that doesn't apply. But then again, there were those who would take the law and apply it to their own ancestors that were pre-law. I can guarantee you there were. They're sticklers to get it right. And it may be that someone in David's heritage did that. If so, maybe that's one of the reasons why David was so excited about bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, dancing before it, placing the Ark back in the tabernacle in Jerusalem, because he was the first of 10 generations of his family to get to worship in the presence of the Ark. How about that? David's song of ascent to Jerusalem in Psalm 122:1 says this, I rejoiced with those who said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord. Boy, it sure gives more meaning to that, doesn't it, if you think about it in this way. The word house here does not refer to heaven. It does not refer to the temple because it hasn't even been built yet. It refers to the tabernacle and to the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. And the same is true in the double entendre of Psalm 23. So could it be that King David had an actual temple made of stone in his mind, not just thinking of the tabernacle, not just thinking about a sheep going to the ranch? Most definitely. We know from 2 Samuel 7 that David did have a strong desire to build a permanent temple of stone for God to replace the tabernacle. I mean, it was a bucket list item for his life, and it's easy to envision how much thought he would give to that idea. When I was 21 years of age, I was dating Amanda, who I ended up marrying, still married to her. She was 17. And we literally, over in Arkansas at Harding University, had a discussion about when we get married, we would someday like to move to Nashville, Tennessee, and build a log house. I, for years, would gather every magazine, every article I could about log houses. I drew up plans, and finally, many years later, decades later, we actually got to build our dream house. You know, it's really exciting to see the house take shape like this with the front porch. It seemed like Noah's Ark for a little while, but now with the front porch on there, I mean, it really starts having this new dimension. I can see a pretty green roof, beautiful green door to match, maybe some lights on each side, and maybe also a little bit of railing around that front porch. Man, it is gonna be awesome. I'm loving this place. It was time to call the biggest man in concrete. Retired professional football player, Dwayne Dotson.
Hello, I'm Dwayne Dotson, former NFL player, middle linebacker, and fullback with the Miami Dolphins. I am now the owner of Dotson Concrete, and we're here to lay some concrete today. Me and my guys are about to get fired up, and we're gonna put this concrete down in a special way.
Let's go!
Yeah.
All right now, all right.
All right. 1, 2, 3, go!
Dwayne Dotson is a beast. I would not want to tackle him on a football field.
One of my favorite parts about the project was the old barn tin roof. My dad had the idea to take the roof of an old barn, turn it upside down, and use it as a ceiling in our house. The next time I was at the property, I walked in, looked up, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was awesome.
That tin ceiling thing is awesome.
It worked.
It's not a secret that my husband kind of lives in his own little dream world, so I wasn't surprised when he said he wanted to build an old cabin inside the house. I think he got the idea, though, from Bass Pro Shop.
Oh yeah, my dad loves Bass Pro Shop more than any other store in the whole world. Pretty sure he was trying to build our own Bass Pro Shop in our house.
All I know is when I walked into the theater room and saw the Trapper's Cabin, I was blown away. All my friends think it is the coolest spot in the whole house.
Good job, honey. I love my Trapper's Cabin laundry room.
It was such a pleasure for my friends to show up and volunteer their time to help work on this house. We did have some good times. I'll never forget the first night we had a meal here. And as soon as the meal was over, we headed out and started working. We had an old sander and we were trying to sand the floors. It kept running us into the walls. We broke some of the sheetrock. We ended up laughing more that night than I'd laughed in a long time. You know, it's wonderful to have that kind of joy and that kind of camaraderie when working together on a project.
Exactly from the devil.
Then came the night of the grand opening. About 80 of my friends showed up that night, including country singer Tim Rushlow and also contemporary Christian artist Steve and Annie Chapman. They performed for us. It was just a wonderful evening, and we asked God, bless this place. Let this be Peace Ridge upon which this house is built. Because when the Lord builds the house, the laborers do not labor in vain. We really thanked God that night for a dream come true. I'm sitting in that log house right now, and I'm in my office teaching this lesson. I'm really thankful I got to see that dream become a reality, and it's a blessing from God here at Peace Ridge. And this is God's house, and we use it to serve Him. Now look at David's dream. He's wanting to build a house for God made of stone. And 2 Samuel 7 tells about it. God answered David with a double entendre. David says, I'm going to build you a house, God. And God says, no, I'm going to build you a house. And God did. He used David's son Solomon to build the temple. And the lineage of David through Solomon goes all the way to Jesus. David couldn't do it because he was a man of blood, but he planned for the temple. He raised the money for the project. How about that? In 1 Chronicles 22, David is an elderly man. He begins making preparations for the temple to be built in Jerusalem, knowing full well that he'll never see it himself. So you can read 1 Chronicles 22, go to 5 through 19, read it for yourself sometime soon. Because in the chapters that follow, chapters 23 through 27, David sets up the organization of all who have anything to do with the construction of the temple and the service in the temple, the Levites, the supervisors, the officials, the judges, the gatekeepers, the musicians of instruments, the singers, the treasurers, the army, the priest. And in chapter 28, David assembles all of the officials of Israel in Jerusalem, and in their presence, he reveals the architectural plans for the temple. And he does this to his son Solomon. David had worked diligently to lay all the groundwork for this new temple. Then guess what he does in chapter 29? We find that David even contributed millions of dollars toward the building campaign. And as the chapter opens, David turned to the officials that were with him and says, I want all y'all to give to this campaign as well. Now look at the value of the gifts. David himself gave, are you ready for this? $1,116,000,000 as we think of US dollars to this campaign. And the officials came up with $235 million. So altogether, David's campaign for the temple raised $1,351,000,000. Now look at the response that the extravagant and passionate giving brings about. You go to 1 Chronicles 29, possibly the most impacting fact is revealed in the whole story, and that is that David did all of this, knowing full well that he would never lay his eyes on the temple. He was a visionary giver. And what does God call David? A man after his own heart. So I guess a little aside to Psalm 23 is, one of the great goals of life is to be open-handed, to be a giver, to plan, to work for the good causes of God's kingdom, just like David did. Even if we are not going to see it with our own eyes, be visionary. Now, is Psalm 23 foreshadowing anything? We know it's a double entendre. We know it's not only talking about the sheep and the pen. We know it's not only talking about the tabernacle and then for David, the temple. Could it mean anything else for us as we read it? Yes. Heaven. Absolutely, it's okay for you to have written that word heaven in there. Now you have a broader understanding. But I do believe Psalm 23 represents for us, on this side of Jesus, going to heaven to live with Him forever. Heaven is a place far greater than any temple. And even the foreshadowing has a double entendre. Not only are we going to get to be in the temple of God in heaven, we actually become the temple of God on earth. Wow. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 19 through 20. Don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? You're not your own. You were bought at a price. So glorify God with your body. Now let's go back at this point and let's read Psalm 23 with all of this in mind. The Lord is my shepherd. I have what I need. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He renews my life. He leads me along the right paths for His name's sake. Even when I go through the darkest valley, I fear no danger, for You are with me. Your rod and Your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. Think about us as sheep. We're very happy. We're satisfied. We're well-loved sheep. We're cared for, protected, fed, watered, bathed, sheared. We have preventive covering. We're the objects of our shepherd's pride and love. And we want to be with him. Who wouldn't? For our whole lives, forever, long as we live. And we know that he fully loves us to the point that he would die for us, because he did. But you know, there are a lot of people who are invited into his flock, but they're sheep in the wrong flock. They're on the other side of the fence, so to speak. And their shepherd, unfortunately, is Satan. And they don't have that deep level of peace and joy that the good shepherd's sheep have. And ultimately, their shepherd is deceiving them. He is leading them to the slaughter. And they don't know this until it's too late. So why wouldn't I want to go to these sheep and have a fence conversation? Why wouldn't you, as God's sheep, try to persuade them to leave their side of the fence and join the flock of the Good Shepherd? Because if you keep this to yourself, then you're selfish, you're unloving, you're prideful, you're a lot of things, but you're certainly not a good sheep. And this brings me to the big aha that I'm going to close with. The aha of Psalm 23. When you add the sheep in the equation with the Good Shepherd, it equals salvation, which then leads to security, which then provides serenity. And as a result of that, you're so happy that of course you want to do what with it? Share it. Psalm 23 is possibly the greatest tool for evangelism that a Christian carries in his or her toolkit. We have the gospel right here. It's the good news. That's what it means, euangelion. This is the best news we can possibly have, and we should share it with every sheep that we come in contact with. Have you ever thought about Psalm 23 like that? Man, I love this study, and I thank you so much for spending 12 lessons with me digging through this gold mine from David. I pray that God will bless you until we meet again on another study.